Your Bible contains a sentence that almost no pastor has ever explained from the pulpit. Psalm 82, verse 1. God stands in the divine assembly. Among the gods he renders judgment. The Hebrew word translated gods in that sentence is elohim, the same word the entire Old Testament uses for God himself. Not a synonym, not an approximation, the identical lexeme used twice in the same verse. This is not a mistranslation. This is not a fringe manuscript. This is the canonical Hebrew Bible, the same text in your Old Testament describing a divine assembly, a council of heavenly beings over which the God of Israel presides as judge. We are not talking about the Book of Enoch. We are not talking about apocryphal texts or Second Temple speculation. Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, Job 1, 1 Kings 22. These are the canonical scriptures that most Christians read every year without being shown what they actually contain. What you were taught about heaven left something out. We're putting it back. In 2015, a biblical scholar named Michael S. Heiser published The Unseen Realm. Heiser held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The book sold over 100,000 copies and quietly changed how a generation of serious Bible readers understood the Old Testament. Heiser died on February 20, 2023, leaving behind peer-reviewed scholarship, journal articles, and hundreds of hours of recorded lectures, still awaiting the serious engagement they deserve. The core of what Heiser spent his career demonstrating is this. The Hebrew Bible presents Yahweh presiding over a structured assembly of divine beings, subordinate beings, organized in a hierarchy, with delegated authority over the nations of the earth, a divine council. This is not a novel or eccentric reading. It draws on scholarship going back decades. Frank Moore Cross at Harvard in 1973, Mark S. Smith at NYU and Princeton, Emanuel Tov at Hebrew University. The textual evidence is there. The ancient Near Eastern context is there. What is missing for most Christians is anyone who has taken the time to explain it. The reason most people have never encountered this picture of heaven is not complicated. The Church Fathers who shaped Christian interpretation, Origen, Chrysostom, Augustine, interpreted the gods of Psalm 82 as human beings, judges and magistrates receiving a figurative divine designation. They were not being dishonest. They were reading the text with the best tools available to them. But two bodies of evidence that would have changed their reading simply did not exist yet. One was discovered in Syria in 1929. The other was found in caves near the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. The Church Fathers who read gods as human judges never had access to the Ugaritic texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls. We do, and what those discoveries revealed about Psalm 82 is the subject of this video. To understand what is happening in Psalm 82, you need to understand the world in which the biblical authors lived. Ancient Israel did not exist in a religious vacuum. It existed within a cultural world that had a very specific picture of how heaven was organized. The Ugaritic texts, clay tablets discovered at Ras Shamra on the coast of modern Syria, dating to approximately 1400 to 1200 BCE, describe in detail the Canaanite divine assembly. The presiding deity is El, called Father of Years, enthroned at the cosmic mountain. Around him, a council of divine beings, including Baal, Asherah, and Mot. Frank Moore Cross, in his landmark 1973 work, Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, demonstrated that this assembly structure did not disappear when Israel's religion developed. It was inherited, adapted, and Yahwehified. Yahweh took the presidential role of El. The council structure remained, but the beings within it were demoted to servants and subordinates of the one God of Israel. Mark S. Smith, in the Origins of Biblical Monotheism, charts the same trajectory from what he calls convergence, where Israel's religion shared structures with Canaanite religion, to differentiation, where Israel increasingly distinguished Yahweh from all other divine beings. The council did not disappear, it was transformed. With that context in place, read Psalm 82 again. God Elohim stands in the divine assembly, Ba'edet El, the congregation of El. Among the gods, Elohim, he renders judgment, the same lexeme applied to the one who judges and to the beings being judged. This is not accidental phrasing. The author knows exactly what he is doing. Verses 2 through 5 move to an indictment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. These beings have been given delegated authority over the nations of the earth, and they have failed in that responsibility. The moral logic is precise. The divine beings are not being judged because they are worshipped by other nations. They are being judged because they failed the people entrusted to them. This is not a polemic against idolatry. It is a verdict in a divine court case. Now look at verse 6. Yahweh speaks directly to these beings. I said, you are God's Elohim, sons of the Most High, Bnei Elyon, all of you. Yahweh himself acknowledges what these beings are. He called them gods. He calls them sons of the Most High. These are his words in the text. And then, verse 7, nevertheless you will die like men, and fall like any prince. This is the sentence, mortality. The beings being addressed are condemned to die. Here is where the human judge's interpretation faces its most serious problem. If the beings in Psalm 82 are already human beings, already mortal, then sentencing them to die like men is not a punishment, it is a tautology. You cannot condemn a human being to become mortal. They already are. The sentence only carries force if the beings addressed were not previously mortal. The punishment is the loss of a divine privilege, immortality. The moment you recognize that, the entire psalm shifts in meaning. These beings were immortal. They are being stripped of that immortality. Psalm 82 is a death sentence on previously divine beings, the most dramatic judgment scene in the Hebrew Bible. This raises a question the psalm itself does not fully answer. Who are these beings? What was their role before they failed? The psalm gives you the verdict without the full backstory. For that, you have to look at two other texts, one from the Torah, one from the books of Kings. That is where the picture becomes considerably stranger. The passage from the Torah is Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, part of what scholars call the Song of Moses, one of the oldest poems in the Hebrew Bible. It describes a moment at the beginning of history when the Most High divided the nations, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of, and here is where two manuscript traditions diverge. The Hebrew Bible, as most people know it, the Masoretic text, preserved by medieval Jewish scribes, reads, according to the number of the sons of Israel, but this reading creates a problem. Israel does not exist yet at the moment this passage describes. The division corresponds to Genesis 10, the scattering at Babel. Israel as a people comes into existence generations later. There is a second problem. The table of nations in Genesis 10 lists exactly 70 nations, Jacob's family descending to Egypt in Genesis 46 numbers, exactly 70 souls, the same number, embedded in the Torah twice. This is a structural signature. The text is telling you that 70 nations were assigned to 70 divine beings, and Yahweh retained one portion, Israel, for himself. But here is where the historical record gets genuinely strange. In 1954, a biblical scholar named Patrick Scahan published his analysis of a manuscript fragment from Cave 4 at Qumran, the same caves that had produced the Dead Sea Scrolls just 7 years earlier. The fragment was a piece of the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32. The manuscript designation is the fourth quarter of 37, also known as 4Q Deutje in the scholarly literature. It is nearly 2,000 years old, predating the medieval Masoretic manuscripts by more than a millennium, and in the place where the Masoretic text reads Sons of Israel, the Qumran scroll reads Bnei Elohim, Sons of God. Two independent ancient traditions, the Septuagint in Greek and the fourth quarter of 37 in Hebrew, both preserve Sons of God where the Masoretic text reads Sons of Israel, produced in different communities. At different times, they agree against the later medieval Hebrew text. This is convergent manuscript evidence pointing in the same direction. Emanuel Tov, one of the world's leading authorities on the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, longtime senior editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project, addresses this directly in Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Tov characterizes the Masoretic reading as an anti-polytheistic alteration, a deliberate scribal change made to remove theologically uncomfortable content. This kind of alteration was not unique to Deuteronomy 32, a passage describing Yahweh distributing the nations among divine beings was, to a later scribe, dangerously close to suggesting Yahweh shared authority with other gods. So the scribe changed Sons of God to Sons of Israel. The theology was protected. The original reading was obscured. What the Dead Sea Scroll preserves is the older reading, the one that predates the alteration, and that reading turns Deuteronomy 32:8 into something entirely different from what most Bible readers have ever seen, a cosmic organizational chart embedded in the Torah describing how Yahweh structured his administration of the world. 70 nations, 70 divine beings assigned to govern them, one nation retained by Yahweh himself. The psalm is the sequel to Deuteronomy 32, which means the question you should now be asking is, if these divine beings were assigned to govern the nations, and they failed, what exactly happened to the nations they abandoned? To answer that, you need a third text, not from Psalms, not from the Torah, from the historical books. 1 Kings chapter 22. The prophet Micaiah has been summoned before King Ahab. He refuses to offer a favorable prophecy and instead describes a vision. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right and on his left. And Yahweh said, Who will entice Ahab, so that he goes up and falls at Ramoth Gilead? This is an extraordinary passage. The prophet is given a vision of Yahweh's throne room, and it is populated. The host of heaven stands in attendance. Yahweh opens a deliberation. Who will carry out this mission? A spirit volunteers. Yahweh approves and sends the Spirit. This is a council meeting. Divine beings are present. A question is posed. A decision is made. The same structural logic appears in Job, chapters 1 and 2, where divine beings present themselves before Yahweh on a specific day. The Hebrew phrase is lehitiatsevu lifnei Yahweh, to take one's station before Yahweh. Courtly, bureaucratic language. Officials presenting themselves before a superior. Council language. Among those who present themselves in Job is a figure the text calls Ha-Satan, with the definite article ha meaning the, Ha-Satan, the accuser, not a proper name, a title, a functional office, a designated accuser testing the loyalty of human beings and reporting back to Yahweh. He acts within Yahweh's permission structure. He is a council member doing a job. The trajectory from this figure to the New Testament Satan takes centuries through the Second Temple period. In Job, the accuser is an office. By the New Testament, Satan is a proper name for a cosmic opponent. The Hebrew Bible gives you the beginning of that trajectory, not its end. What emerges from Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32, Job 1 and 2, and 1 Kings 22 together is a consistently structured picture. Yahweh presides over an assembly. Divine beings hold delegated functions. They can be sent on missions, assigned to nations, called to account. This is the cosmological context within which the biblical authors wrote, deliberately and consistently. The academic framework for naming what Israel's religion actually was requires a distinction most people have never encountered between monotheism and monolatry. Monotheism, in its strict philosophical sense, claims that only one divine being exists. Monolatry, from the Greek words for one and worship, means exclusive worship of one God within a cosmos where other divine beings exist. The first commandment reads, "You shall have no other gods before me." That commandment does not say other gods do not exist. It says Yahweh is to have no competitors for Israel's worship. Monolatry says only Yahweh is worthy of worship. Only Yahweh is sovereign. But the cosmos is not empty. Other divine beings exist in a subordinate and delegated capacity under Yahweh's authority. This distinction has been the working framework of critical Old Testament scholarship since the late 19th century. What Heiser did was apply it rigorously to the divine council texts. His most precise formulation, Yahweh is an elohim, but no other elohim is Yahweh. Yahweh belongs to the category the Hebrew Bible calls elohim, but he is categorically unique within it, ontologically distinct, in a class of his own. What the textual evidence describes is structurally distinct from ancient polytheism. In Mesopotamian or Egyptian pantheons, the gods are peers, competing, negotiating, struggling for supremacy. The divine beings of the Hebrew Bible's council are not Yahweh's peers. They were created. They were assigned. They were held accountable. And in Psalm 82, they were condemned. The Hebrew Bible increasingly emphasizes Yahweh's incomparability, particularly in Isaiah 40 through 55. "I am the first and the last. Besides me there is no God." Heiser argues these passages are best read as incomparability statements, not ontological denials. No other being is like Yahweh, rather than no other divine beings exist at all. Whether that reading of 2nd Isaiah is correct is itself debated. But the trajectory is real. From monolatry toward an increasingly exclusive theological monotheism across the span of the Hebrew Bible. The earliest canonical texts preserve the fuller cosmological picture. By the New Testament, the divine beings have been reinterpreted as angels and demons, but the earlier picture is still there, in the canon, in the original language, waiting to be read. At Babel, according to the older reading of Deuteronomy 32 preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, Yahweh divided the 70 nations among 70 divine beings and retained one nation, Israel, as his own direct inheritance. This is the cosmological backstory to the entire Old Testament narrative. Those divine beings, Bnei Elohim, sons of God, were charged with governing their nations justly, defend the weak, uphold the poor, protect the vulnerable. They failed. Psalm 82 records the verdict. You were gods, sons of the Most High, but you did not govern justly. And then the sentence, you will die like men. Then the New Testament. John 10, verses 34 to 36. The Jewish authorities have accused Jesus of blasphemy. His response is to quote Psalm 82. Has it not been written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods, those to whom the word of God came, why are you charging me with blasphemy for saying I am the Son of God? This is a remarkable canonical moment. Jesus' argument depends entirely on the divine beings of Psalm 82 having a genuine elevated status, a real, not merely figurative, divine designation. If the Psalm 82 beings were merely human judges receiving a symbolic title, the argument collapses. Jesus' defense only works if the Psalm 82 elohim are genuinely elevated beings. The New Testament itself presupposes the divine being reading. The simplification of this cosmology served real purposes. It protected monotheism against syncretism and drew clear lines against polytheistic cultures surrounding early Christianity. The Church Fathers were making a pastoral and theological choice with the best evidence available to them. What 20th century scholarship made available, the Ugaritic texts from 1929, the Dead Sea Scrolls from 1947 onward, is a return to the original horizon of the biblical authors, not a correction of the tradition, a deepening. Many scholars now conclude that the divine council picture, far from threatening the Bible's theological coherence, actually enriches it. Yahweh's sovereignty is not diminished by the existence of subordinate divine beings. It is demonstrated by his authority over them. The psalm ends with a prayer. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you, not to the divine beings. To Yahweh, the council's failure becomes the occasion for Yahweh's direct and universal rule. What the evidence asks you to take away is not a different theology. It asks you to read the same canonical texts with more of the context the original authors had. Psalm 82 is not a problem passage requiring explanation. It is a window into a cosmological picture the biblical authors assumed their readers shared. The beings in Yahweh's council are evidence of his sovereignty, not competitors to it. The assembly exists because Yahweh organized it. The beings hold authority because he delegated it. And when they failed, he judged them. The texts Heiser spent his career pointing to have been in your Bible the whole time. What changed in the 20th century is that archaeology and textual criticism gave us back the context to read them the way their authors intended. That is not a threat to faith. If this kind of reading, going back to the original languages, the original manuscripts, the original context, is what you want more of, this channel exists to do exactly that. Subscribing means you will not miss it. The council chamber, in the end, is not a rival to Yahweh's throne. It is what surrounds it, and at its center, presiding, judging, sovereign, there is only one,